Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Depot Dive, where we're going to dive into three of the biggest Steelers-related topics of the week. My name is Ross McCorkle, your host, and above me on the screen, as always, my co-host, Mr. Joe Clark. Joe, how's everything going with you?
Good. Everything's going well. How about you?
I'm doing well. We got the combine here in a couple of weeks. We're getting our hotels booked and everything like that. Excited to be out there in a couple weeks, sneaking up on us. I mean, I feel we literally just got back from Mobile and from Dallas, and we're on our way to Indy in just a couple of weeks. So busy time of year for us, but plenty of going on in the Steelers world as well that we're going to dive into today. Of course, the biggest and latest breaking news. Some coaching changes, maybe not the ones people wanted. We're going to talk about that and more. We're going to talk about the trade market. There's a lot of names that are being linked to the Steelers. Not a huge surprise in terms of, the positions and the names being linked to the Steelers, but we're going to talk about those nevertheless. And then we'll talk about an interesting comment made by a pretty well-respected former scout in the league, kind of opining that the Steelers might need to change their practice and training camp habits. And we'll weigh in all of that and more. We'll dive right in here with the coaching changes. The big one today was Gerald Alexander was hired officially. Now, that was more or less reported a couple of days ago during the weekend, I think. Or was that Friday that happened?
Yeah, Friday night.
Friday evening, Gerald Alexander was announced, but we weren't sure what that meant for one Grady Brown, who was the sitting coach for the secondary. And today we found out that means, unfortunately, Grady Brown is no longer going to be coaching with the Steelers. His contract wasn't renewed. That's kind of how the Steelers do things. They don't necessarily terminate contracts, but they have these guys on 2-year contracts, and Brown's not renewed. Joe, what's your knee-jerk reaction to that?
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. He was thought to be, at least it seemed he was thought to be, rising coach, maybe a future defensive coordinator. The secondary hadn't been bad under his tenure, hadn't been great, but certainly hadn't been bad, especially with the talent that he had to work with. And so moving on from him is certainly a surprising change, to say the least.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit into, and we'll talk about Aaron Curry and the inside linebacker stuff in a second, but I want to talk about, I think there is a conversation to be had about both coaches that are no longer with the team, and I know both were kind of being viewed as the top young rising coaching talents, but if we look at their individual position groups, how pleased are we with where they are at? Now, Grady has been with the team how long now?
I think this was his third season that he just wrapped up.
Okay, so his third season. Yeah, I just clicked on his page and I got a 404 error for Steelers.com. He is scrubbed from the site. So, yeah. So over the last 3 seasons, particularly let's focus on this season. How would you evaluate the secondary as a whole? And I'll let you start on that one.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I think when you look at the talent that they had versus how guys played, I think Joey Porter Jr., I think we kind of expected a little more of a second year leap. Instead, I think we saw a regression in terms of the penalties. Overall, he was still a very solid cornerback. Dante Jackson started off the year really strong. And then he kind of fell off a little bit in the second half. He fell off like a good bit. But then, beyond that, you have Minka. Minka, I thought more or less did his job. The year wasn't as splashy, but early on in the season, he was taken away in the middle of the field. Deshaun Elliott had a fantastic season and been Pittsburgh's best free agent addition. And I think even getting the play you got from Dante Jackson early in the season can be considered a win because I don't think there are now a ton of expectations of him to come in and really be a legitimate number 2 guy, given he had struggled in Carolina. So I think those 4 guys, even though Porter did maybe take a step back, I think you can say Brown's done a good job with them. Beyond that, the depth pieces, Corey Trice Jr. was okay. He had the interception early, he got hurt, came back. He got an unenviable task of guarding Jamar Chase. I think, decent year two from him. So overall, I mean, I'd probably give that room, an overall like B minus or a B, just given what we had got from them for the majority of the year. But you also had, the slot corner position was a mess. Cameron Sutton came back and was terrible. B.D. Bishop had 4 interceptions, but he wasn't somebody you could necessarily rely on week to week. And like I said earlier, Porter didn't really take that leap, and Jackson did regress a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, there were definitely some issues there, but how much of those are necessarily on Brown? How much of that is the scheme the Steelers are running? So I think he did get a decent, a good bit out of the talent that he had to work with. So I think moving on is a little bit of a surprise, but there were some blips, and if the Steelers really think that Gerald Alexander, I mean, he worked closely with Minka when he was in Pittsburgh, maybe he can get him back to, what Minka said, playing Minka ball and making those splash plays. So maybe they think that Alexander brings something to the room that Curry doesn't and can get more out of him. I mean, he worked under Brown the 2 years prior to last year, so maybe they felt that he was just a better coach, and losing him was a bigger loss than I mean maybe we saw or we expected, and wanted to get him back in there. And the way to do that was to give him the DB's coach job and move on from Brown. But I definitely would classify it as a surprise, and I do think he did a pretty solid job in the coaching the secondary over his tenure here.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of disagreement with what you said there. He was in charge of the turnover culture. The one thing is, the turnovers were great until they weren't. And that's kind of one of the big reasons the Steelers sputtered down the stretch there on defense, and kind of just in general. They were losing the turnover battle, and a lot of that had to do with not creating the turnovers on defense. Now, it's tough because how much can you put on a coach? Some of that's obviously on the players themselves. There's also a scheme aspect to it that the position coach isn't necessarily going to have influence over the scheme. That's going to be more, for the Steelers, probably Tomlin and a little bit of Terrell Austin. So it's tough to kind of gauge these position coaches without actually being in the room. But by all accounts, he was a rising talent. He had that defensive coordinator interview with Raheem Morris and the Atlanta Falcons. And, he's maybe the Mike Tomlin's chance at having a branch on his coaching tree. I know there was kind of that one that popped up this year that I don't know if I necessarily count that. There's a debate to be had there. But, yeah, a little bit disappointing there. I think Beanie Bishop, I mean, you probably look at the young players and how they develop more than you look at older players and how they are playing. Those guys have been coached by a number of different people and kind of are what they are at this point. But if you look at younger guys like Beanie Bishop Jr., I think they got a lot out of him for being an undrafted rookie that basically started the entire season. He had, three total interceptions. Could you really ask for much more from him? It wasn't always great. It never was going to be always great with an undrafted guy. So I look at that. Joey Porter Jr. is kind of the one that's like, okay, maybe this is kind of because Joey Porter Jr. didn't take that next step. It's hard to say. It's also, you never know with these things. We're going to talk about with Curry in a second. Did the Steelers not want Curry around, or did he just, take an opportunity elsewhere? Did he want to move on? I think that's certainly possible as well. Although with Brown, he hasn't been hired elsewhere, so it's more likely that the Steelers were just ready to move on from him. So interesting there. Now moving on to Curry, this was his second year with the team. Joe, evaluate the inside linebackers over the last 2 years, maybe with more of a focus on this year.
Yeah, so his first season will go through quick. I mean, new coach coming into kind of a veteran-laden room. They brought in Landon Roberts, they brought in Cole Holcomb, they brought in Quan Alexander, and I think all those guys kind of surpassed expectations until Alexander and Holcomb both went down for the season, which was disappointing, and then the room fell off. But how much can you really blame Kerr? I mean, he's trotting out like Blake Martinez, who was trading Pokemon cards like a year before. You had Mykal Walker, who really struggled in coverage. You were playing with guys that probably were in positions that shouldn't have been in late in the year. But then Miles Jack shows up late, and he plays really, really well. He played, some of his best football as a Steeler, and the Steelers signed him when he was, not off the streets, and he was a guy that still had some good football left in him. And so I thought I was impressed a lot by him his first year. This year, you had Patrick Queen, you had Peyton Wilson. Patrick Queen coming off an All-Pro season, didn't have that All-Pro level season. He was a little bit up and down. He had some games where he played great, some games where he struggled and missed tackles and looked flat-footed. I mean, some of that can obviously be adapting to a new system, but I didn't get as much out of Patrick Queen as maybe they could have. So fine, fair if you want to argue that against Curry. Peyton Wilson made some really nice plays, used his speed, his heart. He also had some issues, shedding and getting off blocks in the run game. And Leonard Roberts, I thought, did his job and was really solid yet again. I mean, he's a downhill thumper. He's not going to give you much in coverage, but the role that he played, I thought, he did his job. So I don't think it was. I think, yeah, from year 2 to year 1, maybe you can look at Queen not being all pro, not even an all pro level player, but I guess he was a Pro Bowler. But there are some weeks where he definitely didn't have the impact that you would have expected out of a guy that they signed to the richest contract in free agent history. So I still think that he did a really good job. I mean, you look at what he got out of them year 1. If the group wasn't, I don't think you could point to it as one of their biggest weaknesses this year by any means. But I can understand some of the criticism given that what you got out of Queen, that Wilson didn't really seem to progress a ton throughout the year. He did, really become a true impact player for the Steelers as a rookie, which, I mean, he's a 3rd-round pick, even though he had the talent of a 1st-round pick. But either way, I still think he did a good job. It was definitely a little bit surprising to see him get let go. I guess given, they didn't get as much out of Queen as maybe they could have. I understand it more than Brown if they didn't want him back, although I think it was Mark Cabali who reported that it was more his decision than the Steelers' decision to leave. But either way, another one that's surprising, another young up-and-coming coach that I thought had done a really good job through 2 years. Again, maybe a better job year 1 than year 2, but still thought he was a solid coach. And, he really had the respect of that room. Peyton Wilson said he was one of the best coaches he'd ever been around. So going to be interesting to see how they replace him.
Yeah, and this is a guy who had worked with Bobby Wagner in Seattle. I mean, he'd been around some guys. I think a lot of people are probably going to view Brown as the bigger loss just because he had more buzz as like a future DC kind of guy. I think probably Curry is the bigger loss in my calculation, but I guess it just depends who they replace him with. There's plenty of guys out there. There haven't been really any reported meetings yet, to my knowledge, with the team at inside linebacker, and so Gerald Alexander, I don't know a ton about him, obviously, other than him being with the team for 2 years as an assistant guy. Those guys don't necessarily have the most exposure to things, but I thought it was kind of curious last year. We didn't see Grady Brown on the scouting trail at all. I mean, we sift through, like people's Snapchats and Twitters and Instagrams and everything at all these pro days, and we did not spot Grady Brown really anywhere, which was unusual given that it was a position of need. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't, probably didn't have anything to do with this, but I just don't know how big of a factor he really was after all, other than just kind of spearheading the turnover thing. But moving on to the next topic here, Joe, I'm gonna ask you some rapid fire questions here in terms of some free agent or trade kind of possibilities that have been floated around, and you can give me a yes or a no. And if it's a yes, we'll double click and kind of discuss that candidate for just a moment. We're going to start off with a bang here. Mr. 41-year-old ayahuasca retreat himself, Aaron Rodgers.
No.
I don't think you're going to get any disagreement from me here at all. And who was it? Deshaun Elliott just said he can leave his, what did he say? He could leave his old ass on the couch or something like that, basically in retirement. So it doesn't sound like that is a popular option among at least some of the Pittsburgh Steelers locker room. And I think it would probably draw too much of a circus to be worth it. Davante Adams, his teammate.
If he doesn't follow Rodgers somewhere, then yeah, I'd be interested in Davante Adams.
Okay, I think I would agree with that. I think he said he was kind of looking more for West Coast teams, but he also did say he's 100% willing or would love to play for Mike Tomlin, I think was the quote. So there's maybe a possibility there. He's up there in age as well, But, if you could sign him and keep Pickens around as kind of the stopgap solution, I think you probably still have to draft somebody high in that case. But it would certainly make them more dangerous in 2025 for this upcoming season. A couple other receivers. Cooper Kupp.
If the Rams eat some of the money on his contract, then yes.
Okay, I think the report was basically people are viewing him more or less like a Keenan Allen type in terms of his trade last year. He was traded. They did not end up eating any of his contract, the Chargers. That is, the Bears took on his entire contract, but it was a 4th-round pick in return. I don't know if I threw out the Steelers need to give up a 3rd-round pick, but 40% of that salary is paid by the Rams, meaning I don't know what that number would be. It'd be like $12 million or something that the Steelers would owe. Would you take that deal?
I wouldn't do it for a third. No, I think I like how deep this draft class is. I think they could still get a productive receiver in the third, or at another position in need, they could double up a defensive line, could go cornerback, and obviously have that guy under more control and cheaper. So for a third, I would say no.
So you would not take the Keenan Allen, take the full salary on for a 4th-round pick type thing if it's a 1-for-1 kind of comparison there?
No. Nope. Okay.
Fair enough. I think the Steelers do have some cap space, but depending on what they do at quarterback, if they bring back a Russell Wilson, you're going from paying a guy $1.21 million to paying probably at least $25 million at the very least per season. And I wouldn't be surprised if they did a 2-year deal for that, which is, you're probably looking at, probably more in the range of 27, 28, maybe even somewhere in that range money. So salary cap, there is space in theory right now, but taking into account you are going to have a quarterback to pay for after not paying for one last year, pretty much. Deebo Samuel.
Same caveat as Kupp. Yes, if the 49ers eat some money, and I think the latest report today was they're willing to eat money, and it's likely the compensation would be 1 or 2 day 3 picks. And I think I would do that for Deebo Samuel just to see, if he's reinvigorated back in Pittsburgh, if what he's got left in the tank. I think he'd be a decent addition to the room.
So the Steelers most likely, they don't have a 6th, so they'd have to give up that either a 4th or a 5th, and then one of their 7ths probably. If they could do it for a 5th and a 7th, I'm for it, especially if the salary is split a little bit. But I feel like if they're going to take on some of the salary, they're probably going to want that 4th-round pick in return, plus whatever else. So between those two, who would you rather have? Kupp, Samuel, or I guess between those 3, or Adams?
I think I would probably go with Adams. I mean, Kupp and Samuel have both been banged up. And I mean, Adams has too. Adams has dealt with injuries, but especially the last few years, Kupp and Samuel have missed some time. Samuel has only played 15 games the last 2 years, which only 4 games missed in 2 years. But he had a big injury a few years ago. Kupp has missed a ton of time, and I think Devontae Adams on the field this season was more explosive. Kupp made some nice plays when he was healthy, but there's definitely some signs of decline. I like him a lot as a blocker, but assuming that Adams is cut. Then you obviously don't have to give up draft capital to sign him. And then I would much prefer that than having to give up draft capital than for Kupp or Samuel. I don't think, a team's going to take him on at whatever his contract would be worth after the season, Adams. So I think the most likely path is him getting cut by the Jets. And I think that signing him as a free agent would definitely be preferable than giving up assets for Kupp or Samuel, because he might wind up being the better player next season anyway.
Yeah, man, I don't know exactly which guy. I would probably agree just the Adams angle just because of no draft compensation. But if compensation wasn't a thing, I think I would probably lean towards Kupp of the 3 when, obviously all 3 of them have injury kind of history lately. But I think Kupp, he's, I guess, more effective in the slot, but he can play all over. I think he'd allow the Steelers to do some things there. I think he probably intrigues me the most, but I'm not necessarily sure if I'm sold on any of the three. To be completely honest, maybe there's a younger guy involved. Because this leads me to my next point. What are you actually accomplishing with any of these kind of older guys? You're still gonna have to draft one high, no?
I would think that a receiver would probably be within their first three picks regardless. I think they might convince themselves if they get one of these older guys that they can wait a little bit longer. I do think one of them, you avoid needing to take a receiver in the first or the second round, which means you can address defensive line early, and then you can address, quarterback, cornerback, maybe quarterback if you want to. I mean, we've talked about it's not a super thrilling options out there, but if you really fall in love with a Jalen Milroe or Will Howard, you could address quarterback earlier, but you can address the secondary and then wide receiver in the third round. I think probably makes some sense. I think if you don't get one of them, receiver in the first or the second round is probably a direction that you kind of have to lean, just given how horrible the production was this season outside of Pickens. And then maybe you have to kick the can on running back or quarterback, or even running back is a deep class. That's fine kicking the can, but on cornerback or another position where they might want to take somebody that is a higher end talent on the first or the second round, and then they have to wait till the third because you need to draft a receiver. But I do think they should go out and get a veteran guy there, just because rookies can be unreliable. The Steelers have been hesitant to play rookies early on. And so just having a veteran just as a safety blanket, and a veteran that's obviously a clear upgrade over, the Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller, Quez Watkins, the group they brought in last offseason, I think is probably something they kind of have to do given how much of a disaster that plan was last year.
Yeah, I think if you listen to things that Mike Tomlin says, the wide receivers are some of the most pro-ready group because of the advent of 7-on-7 football. These guys are playing basically year-round, and there's a lot of receivers kind of hit the ground running in the NFL, and so yeah, I do think that they are slow to include guys. But if you look at their last few rookies that they had, I mean, Calvin Austin III injured, Roman Wilson injured. It just kind of depends if they get a full. I mean, when's the last rookie that we saw get like a full? I guess it would have been Pickens.
Yeah, Pickens, and then I mean Claypool came on a little bit slow, but once he got rolling his rookie year, he had a good rookie year. So I mean, I guess with receiver, it could certainly be different. With how, I mean, you look at the guys this year: Lab McConkey, Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors, all those guys came in and were immediate instant impact players, and there were a ton of other guys too. So I mean, I hope they're not cautious with the receiver, and I guess they weren't really with Pickens or Claypool. So just because the injuries to Austin and Wilson kind of limited their impact. So, well, yeah, maybe that's just kind of more of a generalization across the board. But for receivers, hopefully they'll let them play.
What are you looking at Roman Wilson? Like, do you view him as? I mean, he's kind of a wild card right now. Do you view him Calvin Austin year two? Not a huge factor. Do you view him? What's the level of optimism?
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning the Calvin Austin year two sort of level of production. Maybe a little bit more there, but I mean the fact you still have Calvin Austin. I know you can kick Wilson outside a little bit, but he's still primarily a slot receiver. So there's a question of how many snaps he's going to get, especially if they do add another slot receiver, somebody like Cup. Uh, which again, that's a hypothetical, but I'm just not really sure how many opportunities are going to be there for him to make a huge impact. I mean, he did look good early on in training camp before he got hurt, and that was also really before the pads came on. So tough to really say, oh yeah, he looked good when you don't have the pads on. But I'm not super optimistic they're going to get a really solid year two out of him, just because the lack of opportunities. He wasn't healthy last season, didn't have a ton of experience even in practice, given he missed a lot of time during training camp. So I'm pretty apprehensive to rely any heavily at all on Roman Wilson.
Fair enough. I think probably most of us are in the same boat there. Moving on to our third topic here, and this one should be pretty quick, but an interesting comment as I teased at the top of the show. Daniel Jeremiah appeared on the Sheck Show with Dave Damashek and was talking about the Steelers kind of falling off at the end of the season, and they've done that a couple years now. And he made an interesting comment about, well, they should probably at least take a look at their practice habits and their training camp habits, because the Steelers are the most physical training camp, bar none. I I think The Athletic did a survey last year and kind of asked, how often does the team you cover, this was asking kind of beat writers of these teams, how often does the team you cover tackle in practice? And the Steelers were the only very often response. I think there was like 3 or 4 teams that were often. It was like the Chiefs, the Dolphins, the Lions, a couple other, physical teams in practice. But the Steelers seem to kind of go harder than everybody else in training camp and practice. I don't know if I did a little research. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this assertion, because obviously Tomlin's been around for a long time, 18 years. And if you look at how he started seasons versus how he's ended seasons, he's always had these physical, tough practices and training camps. As a matter of fact, his very first training camp was one of the most brutal, according to players, just because Tomlin was trying to prove himself there. And if you look at the results, they've had times where they've started 0-4 and they've finished great down the stretch. They've had times where they start, 12-0 or whatever it was, 11-0, and then they sputter down the stretch. 2020 as an example there. So I don't know if there's any hard conclusions. The Steelers have a .630 win-loss percentage, both, as a whole in the regular season and in the months of December and January. So his win-loss percentage is the exact same between those 2 time periods. So I don't know if I buy it. Joe, do you buy that? And if not, what are some changes that maybe could be practical, could make a difference for this team?
Yeah, I just can't really get behind it. I mean, look at the team 2 years ago. They won their last 3 games of the regular season, yet in the playoffs. It's a team that has had successes late in the season. I mean, outside of this year, usually the run game's getting better down the stretch, and I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that they've been physical all season. They've been beat up, so when teams are normally getting beat up, they're not, they're used to it. They're a weathered team. So I don't necessarily think that's really their problem. I think this year, the lack of offensive innovation kind of late in the season and doing the same thing over and over to no success, and not being, as we touched on earlier, the turnovers kind of went away late in the season. The run defense faltered. I don't know how much of that is a byproduct of them being tired from, what they did in August. I think teams haven't figured out this season. They played, some really, really good teams. They played the 2 Super Bowl contenders within in a 3-week stretch, and then the Ravens in between that. So they just played a difficult schedule, and I think they probably weren't as good as they looked early in the season. And I think maybe you can argue that the byproduct of them being good early in the season was them being better prepared. And that's how they jumped out to, 10-3 start. And then they played a gauntlet of teams that were simply better than them. And they had no answer and kind of just sucked all around. So I don't think that the training camp stuff really goes back to it. I mean, what changes should they make? I mean, they already give guys plenty of veteran rest days. There's plenty of days that they're in shells and they're not going super hard every single day. So I don't really know what necessarily has to change. I mean, this year we saw them move practices earlier in the day, which avoids some of the sun. It helps guys with their nutrition. So um, yeah, I mean, I think that was a good change. I think the weekend practices are the only ones that are later in the day. I mean, I guess maybe you can move those early in the day, but then that gives fans less of an opportunity to show up. But I don't really have any, like, off the top of my mind, changes that they should really institute, besides don't have the starting quarterback push the sled on the first day of conditioning.
Yeah, amen to that. Can't be doing that anymore. And I mean, this was a new kind of strength and conditioning staff last year, and so they now have a year of experience with their feet underneath them. So hopefully you see better results. I think Mike Tomlin talked about the need to address kind of keeping their guys healthier as an organization, and so that is an ongoing conversation as well. Some of it's just freak stuff, but some of the soft tissue stuff, a lot of groins, a lot of hamstrings and stuff like that over the last couple of years. That is something that is manageable. It's not totally preventable, but it's manageable if they're doing things correctly. So I'm sure they'll take a look, though I'm not an exercise scientist, so who would I be to throw any hard suggestions out? I'm sure the people that are being highly paid are all over that and focused on that every day. We're going to move on to our questions here to wrap up the show. And we have a first-time caller here from London, actually. Pretty interesting. This is Alyssa.
Hi, Ross and Joe. My name is Alyssa. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, but have been living in London for the past 9 years. I found the Terrible podcast just after I moved, and it's been my lifeline to keeping up with the team. So thanks to Dave, Alex, and the rest of the Depot crew. I've been lucky enough to get back almost every year for a game, but I'm very excited about the announcement that the Steelers are coming to Ireland this year, which is a much shorter trip for me. My question for you is, in general, what do you both think of the continued increase and expansion of the international games? Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for calling, Alyssa. Same kind of routine for me, actually. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and actually, when I moved away from Pittsburgh, I was in London for a couple of years myself. I was in Surrey in southwest London. My dad's job moved us out there when I was in grade school. So, absolutely know a thing or two about watching football out your way. My parents would let us stay up at, gosh, I can't remember the exact time of night, but I feel like the games were starting at, if it was a night game, those games were starting 2 or 3 in the morning or something like that, and they would absolutely let us watch them, and we'd get to skip school the next day. So that was always a great time. To answer your question here about the international expansion in Ireland and just kind of the NFL expanding in general, they obviously want to increase their footprint abroad, and that's going to bring with it an increased salary cap, an increased earning potential for players, for coaches, for organizations, and it's going to make the sport better in some ways. But are there drawbacks? I think probably so. They're working towards getting an international game for every team every season. That is going to bring challenges in terms of some of these travel schedules are going to get tough. In the past, you've been able to elect to kind of have a bye week after you travel. Is that going to be possible if, every team is playing one every season? That seems like a scheduling nightmare. Good luck to the schedule makers on that. And just in general, what does this mean for the future of the sport in terms of, I think it was Judy Batista on NFL Network was saying, there could be an international Super Bowl eventually, and that would be tied to an expansion team, so having a team abroad in somewhere like London, and that's an interesting thing. If that happens, that seems like a nightmare as well. That team's going to be traveling a ton. There's competitive advantages and disadvantages to that I think are tough to wrestle with. Joe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think I like expanding the game to a global audience. I like, adding games in new places. They added the Melbourne game, the Ireland game, the game in Brazil. Like, the travel for the teams stinks, and that perspective is something that really has to be looked at if they do continue to expand, which it seems like they will. So I like the concept, but I do think, as you said, the NFL has to really be careful about how they're kind of going about this and making sure that doesn't become overkill and doesn't become too much, and teams aren't getting wiped out from travel, and that we're not really just pushing things beyond where they need to be. The NFL obviously sees it as an opportunity for more money and to really put the global footprint on the game. And I think it's fun and I like it. And hey, 10 a.m. football in the East Coast when they play these international games, at least the ones in London and Germany, that's pretty fun too. So from a fan perspective, like, yeah, it's cool. It's fun. I like it. And I like seeing other people get a chance to see their favorite teams play that might not have. But I think the NFL just really has to make sure it's not overextending themselves with these international games, and it's something that doesn't just become money, 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 and it really is something that will try to help the growth of the game and isn't going to seriously impact the players on the field and the product from guys having to travel from the West Coast to London or something like that. So it's good for now, but I think it has to kind of be monitored and make sure that NFL doesn't go overkill with it.
Yeah, I agree there, and I hope we answered your question, Alyssa. Thank you again for giving us a call. We hope to hear back from you soon. If you guys want to have your question answered, that's 412-254-3145. Again, 412-254-3145. You can text that or give us a call and leave a voicemail for a chance to have your question answered on a future episode. We promised Brett last week that we would get to his question because we skipped over it last week. And we do thank you, Brett, for leaving this question. I'm going to just summarize it here because we're running a little short on time. Brett basically called in and had a a solid argument of why the Steelers are kind of they're lacking in innovation, or not an argument, or rather an explanation of, okay, like, why are they lacking in innovation? He pointed at things like, why aren't the Steelers doing things like the tush push as much? I mean, you saw some teams kind of adopt that after the Eagles had success and after the competition committee said, we're not going to get rid of it. Well, that's the green light for other teams to all go ahead and get their own version of the tush push. And you had a guy like Justin Fields who could probably operate it pretty well. So he was pointing at that and short yardage situations, using things like fullbacks, whatever it might be in these short yardage situations to get an edge. And he just didn't see a lot of the Steelers kind of trying to get an edge in those situations. Joe, do you agree? Do you think they should do things like the tush push? Are there any basic innovations you think they could do that wouldn't be, too out of the realm of possibility? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw them run the tush push a few times this past season. I think we've also seen that not every team can run it like the Eagles can. I mean, the Bills have Josh Allen at quarterback, and they struggled to run it against the Chiefs. It's just not something that necessarily works for every single team. I do think maybe that the Steelers should be more innovative. I agree with that. We don't really see a lot of, the most exciting, we saw the flea flicker twice this year. One time it worked, one time it didn't. Other than that, we're just seeing like jet sweeps. We're not seeing any, like, we did get the fake punt against Washington, although that's not really an offensive innovation. That's more special teams. I do think maybe adding, a few extra tweaks to try to figure out, what the Ravens have Mark Andrews run the tush push QB sneak for them. Maybe get somebody just bigger in there to run it instead. Last year you have Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, and I think Fields ran it decently well. Wilson was fine when he did it, but they just didn't do it all that often. So yeah, I think they need to get more innovative. How to do that, I don't really have any great ideas off the top of my head right now, but I do think we did see some of that stuff last year. It's just not going to work necessarily with some of the personnel that they had versus what, the Eagles, who have been running it for years, have.
Yeah, I could see a future where the tush push comes in. I think there probably needs to be an ongoing discussion about whether the tush push deserves to stay in the NFL. I personally am against it, to be honest. I don't think it's a very interactive gameplay, but I guess it is unfairly punishing one team who runs it really well. Like Joe said, not everybody runs it very well. I think there is a future, though, where the Steelers could run it well. I think Zach Frazier certainly has kind of the power to make it happen. I think guys like Mason McCormick could have the power and nastiness to make it happen. Kind of those interior guys, they probably need to find another, whoever that next guard is that steps in for Sayamalu. Is that somebody big enough that can kind of make the scrum work? Who are you putting behind him? Is it guys like Connor Hayward? I think Brett said Cameron Hayward. That would be interesting. You could put some big guys back there. It's just, I think there is a future where it's possible where they could be successful given some of the guys they have, especially if Fields, or especially if they get one of these other kind of athletic archetype quarterbacks in the future draft, either this year or next year. So, hopefully we do see some of that, because I personally get very frustrated every time I watch the Eagles execute that, probably because it works so well. And it just kind of pisses me off, but it makes me jealous that the Steelers can't. So I would love to see them do that, no doubt. Thank you for the question, Brett. As always, we always appreciate you calling in. That is everything for today. I am Ross. That is Joe. You can follow us on Twitter at Ross_McCorkle, and you can follow Joe at at JClark1233. Is that right? Nailed it.
Yep.
Sort of. And we will catch you guys next week.